I just wanted to make a few remarks on the Climate Change Authority and some of the work that we're doing and how that might intersect and interact with the work that the climate modeling community through ACCESS-NRI and possibly through the CMIP7 process, how that might play out, and some of the questions that we're starting to engage in and grapple with. Some of the modeling capabilities could help. First of all, I apologize for not being there in person. We just have too many looming deadlines at the moment. I'd love to be there, of course. I enjoy these kind of workshops and talking about this science. So first, quick couple remarks about the Climate Change Authority. For my sins, I'm the lead scientist of the Climate Change Authority. And I don't know how much people know about the Climate Change Authority, but we are an independent statutory agency within the government. We live in the environment climate change portfolio, but we're not part of the department, if that makes sense. We're set up by our own legislation. We have a board and a secretariat, and we report through our board to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. So that sort of gives you an idea of what we are. We have a chair currently and 8 members of our board, and we're growing rapidly. We're I think last I checked, we're a bit over 40 people. And to put it in perspective, this time last year, I think we were at about 9 people. So we've grown rapidly, and that growth reflects both a renewed and sort of revised legislative mandate from the government in their renewed legislation on climate change, which gives the Climate Change Authority quite a few new responsibilities and tasks. And along with that, we also got a fair bit more support. And so we're growing in terms of the number of people, and we're going to a model where we'll have 65 employees sometime this year. So that gives you an idea that we're growing rapidly. We have a remit, in part a legislative remit, to advise the government on the minister's annual climate statement, and we do that through providing an annual progress report to the government on how are we doing on climate change and our targets, and the impacts that climate change is having on Australia and is likely to continue to have. And that's sort of a yearly responsibility. We also have some legislative responsibilities to review particular pieces of legislation. This year, we are reviewing the Emissions Reduction Fund and the NGERS legislation, which is the legislation that under which the safeguard mechanism operates, not as much of scientific interest. And the other big thing, which again is where some of the modeling is relevant, is that we are advising the government on its next set of targets under the Paris Agreement, the next nationally determined contribution, and what that should be and what that should look like. And I think that this is where the work of ACCESS-NRI in your community becomes most relevant in near term. So one of the things that is different about our remit now is that we have a remit to think about adaptation and resilience, and that's a challenge for us because it raises the question of how do we report to the government on our progress on adaptation? How do we metrics? There's some of the work being done by some of the partners in ACCESS-NRI, the NESP Climate Systems Hub, and their adaptation initiative. Some of the work being done in the Australian Climate Service, of course, around hazard modeling and the coupling of sort of exposure vulnerability into considering those hazards and how they might be affected by climate change. And so those kind of give you an idea of some of the big initiatives that we're working on. I lead a small team of really hardworking, energetic people, and we're in charge of looking at the Climate Change Authority's work on the climate science piece, the climate adaptation and resilience piece, and we're also in charge of looking at and leading a fairly large project on carbon sequestration. So other than that, we don't have much to do. And so I think that one of the interesting things for this workshop and for the purposes of CMIP is that our remit includes considering the impacts of climate change, especially on regions and on communities, and in particular mention of the impacts of climate change on First Nations peoples. But we also have a responsibility for looking at the flip side of that. What are the impacts of climate change policies on the economy, communities, regions, First Nations people? And so we, again, are charged with advising, again, on this mitigation side, which is mostly the history of the climate change already has focused on that. But we are also charged with this resilience and adaptation piece. And I think as we sort of move, the government has set a goal of net zero by 2050. As I don't think I need to tell anyone in this audience, that's an extremely challenging objective to try to achieve. And we engage in some modeling, and we have teams that are looking at modeling both in the sense of the whole economy through, CGE type models, computable generalized equilibrium models of the whole economy. We also have teams within, again, our analysis branch who are looking at different sectors. So land, agriculture, and waste is one sector, power and transport, another sector, industry, other sectors, because we recognize that any path to net zero requires all these sectors. And we're starting to analyze and consider sequestration, in a sense, its own sector in many ways. So I think some of the big questions that we're trying to grapple with at the moment are this question about adaptation. How do you measure progress on adaptation? What would you use as a set of metrics? Do you take a vulnerability lens to it and consider the interaction of hazards and exposure? Certainly that's an approach. But again, we, as you probably, as we all know, many cases our assessment of adaptation is often retrospective. We find out what was and what was not well adapted after acute events. So that's a key question. I think another key question is, where are the interactions between Earth system processes and economic processes? And I think Christian somewhat alluded to that in talking about the challenge of creating an electric grid largely powered by variable renewable resources. And so in that context, weather becomes a resource. So the real important question around how do we construct a grid, and the government has said it's got its goal of having 82% of our electricity come from variable renewables. How do we construct such a system and manage the weather risks and possibly the climate risks of building that kind of system? So I think that's a really important question for modeling. And I think the other one, which we're grappling with as well, is how does the Earth system itself respond to different interventions? And that can include large-scale interventions in land use, which perhaps large-scale deployment of renewable energy might constitute one of those interactions. So, or large-scale planting, for example, of forest resources for carbon sequestration. So I think there's an interesting question there about, how does a model like LUTO interact with a model like ESM 1.5?
Will, one minute to go.
Yep, and I think the final one is just around this question around sequestration and the question of where are the climate risks? Where do we place especially surface land-based sequestration resources? And what are the risks to reversals of the resources from phenomena like bushfires and droughts? And I think that feeds into this question of, again, for us, sequestration and how much we may have available, how much we may need. So I think that kind of covers kind of some of the big questions we're asking. And I think those kind of lead to, for me anyway, really engagement with some of the MIPS, and I don't know where you've gotten deciding that, but certainly the scenario MIPS, CDR MIPS, and land use MIPS are certainly relevant to the kind of questions that we're trying to answer. So I'll leave it there, and thank you for giving me this time.